Greetings, everyone. We were just saying it's wonderful to see so much enthusiasm for the STEP. So, yes, today's STEP. My name is Faith Hillis. I'm the director of CEERES, and I'm really pleased to introduce this panel today, Thinking with the STEPs as an Environmental, Socio-Political, and Epistemic Space. So the majority of the conversation is going to be, well, a conversation. So we have two specialists here who are going to talk about their work on the Kazakh steppe, and this discussion is going to be moderated by a third. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of them. So in the middle, we have Gail Bratcher, who is a PhD candidate in history here at the University of Chicago. Gail's dissertation is entitled The Second Virgin Lands Campaign, Ecological Imperialism and Livestock Agriculture on the Steppe, 1891 to 1980. It uses the tools of environmental history and the history of science and technology to explore the nature of Russian and Soviet imperialism in Kazakhstan through the lens of cattle raising. On your right, or your left, we have Olga, who is co-convener of the Climate Change Education Reading Group at the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. Come on in to those just arriving. Olga's main research interest is the topics of epistemic injustice across all levels of education and reparative ways to address them. Her doctoral project at Oxford University is looking at environmental education in Central Asian and global higher education, with a focus on what glaciers and steppe tulips can teach us about climate change and sustainability. And then moderating the discussion today, we have Darya Tsymbalyuk, who is assistant professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at the University of Chicago. She is an interdisciplinary researcher whose work lies at the intersection of the environmental humanities and artistic research. Darya is the author of the book Ecocide in Ukraine, The Environmental Cost of Russia's War, which is now out, or very nearly out. Friday. Congratulations, out Friday on Polity Press, with Polity Press. And she's also the author of The Limits of Collaboration, Art, Ethics, and Donbass, co-written with Victoria Donovan in collaboration with artists and curators Dmytro Cheporny, Viktor Zasipkin, Alexander Kuchinsky, and Katarina Sirik. So again, welcome and thank you to our panelists.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Faith, and thank you so much, Mike, for organizing it and for really creating the space for us and making it possible to be present both here in person and online. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm here in my role as a steppe enthusiast and so somebody who was raised in the steppes in the south of Ukraine, and mostly just to learn from Olga and Gail, and just amazed that we can share and speak together. I'll it will be structured as a conversation. We'll just start with 3 questions that kind of go back and forth. And then we'll probably open the floor to the audience. And I'll start with a very broad question of how do you actually define the steppe in your research and practice? I'm thinking whether it's, as defined in our title, whether it's the social historical space, whether it's an ecosystem, where does the steppe end, where does it, extend, I think is a question, and whether there are any challenges that you encounter in engaging with the notion of the steppe. We'll start with Gail.
Well, before I answer that, I want to say thank you, everybody, for spending your time here with us on the steppe. Thank you, CEERES and Faith Hillis, for sponsoring this event, and Mike for getting the AV all set up for us. And especially thank you to Darya for suggesting the event in the first place and organizing everything and making it happen. And yeah, for introducing me to Olga. We've had a great time preparing for this, and I'm looking forward to continuing to learn together in conversation. So to get back to the question, how do you define the steppe in your research and practice? Like a good historian, my hard and fast answer to this question is I define the steppe as my historical actors did. So in my dissertation, which spans from 1891 and fizzles out around 1980, those actors are government officials, so both Tsarist government officials and Soviet government officials, from the Secretary General of the Communist Party all the way down to collective farm chairmen, levels of administration. So that's one group. And then the other is our natural scientists across the decades. So these are soil scientists, my personal favorite, plant breeders, agronomists, and geographers. And in my research, I come across three main ways that these two groups of actors define the steppe. So one I have listed here as a political entity. So administratively, they create political borders and later ethno-territorial lines defining the steppe. The second is as a biome. So they define the steppe as a biosphere comprised of soil zones and agroclimatic zones at various scales of analyses. And then they also define it comparatively. So they think of the Eurasian steppe as one grand land mass, and I'll have a map coming up later, that's comprised of the Kazakh steppe, the Ukrainian steppe, the Hungary steppe, the Kamenaya steppe. And then they also think comparatively, looking at these steppes globally. So comparing the Eurasian steppe with the prairies of North America, the Pampas in Argentina, the grasslands of Australia. So now I have some cool maps to show. So this one is a map of the steppe cry from 1886 to 1918. This was the Governor Generalship of the steppe cry. The next map. This is the Tsymbalyuk cry. So this was created in 1960. It existed from 1960 to 1965. Nikita Khrushchev kind of reorganized the oblast in the north of Kazakhstan around grain production as a part of his Virgin Lands campaign. So this is one way to kind of define the steppe. Yes, this. This is the soil map. The soil map of the Kazakh SSR. I think this was made in 1976. But anyway, you can see, this is my crude interpretation of the map. There are many colors in the north, so it's different. It's not all the same thing. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. This is a map of the agroclimatic zones. So this is considering the soils, the plant cover, the climate, and also you'll notice not only the colors, but the shapes, and they're different and overlapping. And then there's a last map, and this just speaks to the ways that my actors define the steppe comparatively. This is just looking at the Eurasian steppe, and you can see it's quite large. So importantly, I'm also tracing the kind of the imbrication of these three ways of conceptualizing the steppe. So, you know, how environmental understandings intermixed with territorial understandings, intermixed with like comparative understandings. For example, like how statesmen and scientists determine the ethno-territorial borders of the Kazakh Republic along agricultural production zones. Or at other times, how the steppe was defined by the predominance of Chernozem soils. And so it linked the Kazakh steppe conceptually with the steppe in Ukraine. So ultimately, I argue in my dissertation that the way Imperial Russian and Soviet statesmen and scientists define the steppes had material consequences. These definitions inspired and justified Russian and Soviet imperial projects. Language matters. In this way, I'm inspired by feminist decolonial approaches to science and technology studies, and the rigor in which they approach post-humanist and new materialist thought. So the advantage of this is that I can trace the genealogy of Russian and Soviet imperialism to understand it, to then be able to critique it and challenge it. The disadvantage of viewing the steppe in this way is that I'm missing entirely the question of how Kazakh nomadic pastoralists defined and understood the steppe. Although you could say, and I will, part of my point is to show how this epistemic knowledge was devalued and erased. And this kind of absence is simply a function of the structure of the archive. I went to Kazakhstan and, as a good historian, went to the state and party archives and researched agriculture on the steppe, and the Kazakh perspective was very almost absent. Very little was represented. So I figured, in order to appreciate the Kazakh ways of knowing the steppe, I imagine that one would have to know Kazakh language better than I do, and look to artistic, lyrical, philosophical, oral expressions. And these are all skills that I don't have right now. So that is my answer to how steppes are defined. Olga.
Yes. Thank you so much, Gail, actually, for this transition. And also, it's a great privilege to be a part of this community. And thank you so much, Darya and Mike, and all of my colleagues from the Comparative and International Education Society who came to support me. And I think I was just reflecting on it. If we don't have an audience, does our own knowledge matter? I'm not sure. So I think I invite you to our community of steppe researchers. So how do I define the steppe? So I entitled this page, Grieving and Repairing with the Steppe, Interpreting Steppe Temporalities, Modernities, and Epistemologies. So this is a picture of the steppe tulips that were collected by my grandmother, who was the first person from my maternal line who moved to live in the steppes, and that's how our family history begins, through the line of my grandmother. So this is the original steppe tulips that you are not supposed to pick up, actually, because the way tulips regenerate, and in order for them to bloom next year, you actually have to leave them in the ground. So I am critically reflecting and aware of that. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away before I was born. So this is just a memory. And in my work as a self-proclaimed post-foundational comparative and international education scholar, I'm mostly engaged with decolonial understanding of the steppe, even though I respect a more traditional scholarship. And I think, for me, the way I interpret decolonial scholarship is to highlight the pluriversality of knowledges. So I'm very grateful for the type of research you do, because it precisely shows the structural issues in the definition of the steppe. And because I work in education, I work with steppe epistemologies based on the Kazakh oral folklore, proverbs, stories, literature. Kazakh language is very rich, and they have a lot of their own forms of steppe oral folklore, which is much bigger than just proverbs. So it's very complex. Kazakh language is my second language. I'll do my best at explaining some of the concepts. But so primarily for today, my engagement with the steppe is epistemological. So I did a project on Kazakh proverbs and Malaysian proverbs called Telagajer. It's an artistic zine that is available online, where we have analyzed environmental proverbs and how the steppe was represented in the proverbs. We have analyzed dozens of proverbs, more than 30. And it's quite fascinating the way you see how nomadic people and cosmology actually had a deep interpretations of the steppe and the importance of living sustainably. And in Kazakh language, there is a concept, it's called Obal philosophy. So in Obal philosophy, it's part of the general cosmology of educational philosophy in Central Asia. In nomadic cultures, the life of the child is very important. And in Kazakh philosophy, there are 3 cycles of how you educate a child. The primary cycle is called Tarbiya, and it's in the early childhood education. Actually, I have to make an important disclaimer that this work was developed in collaboration with 2 of my co-authors, Professor Guljanat Gafur from Nazarbayev University and Professor Azuddin Anwar Mohammed. I'm very grateful for them. It's not my individual work. And so the early childhood concept is centered around 3 concepts. Uyat, which is in Kazakh, it means shame. So basically, how to shame a child, what not to do, or an adult. Obal, which is an environmental philosophy of sustainability. And Sawab, a reward system. So Abal usually, I will only speak about Abal because to me it's more about the step philosophy and sustainability. It has 3 key aspects. One is, in our interpretation, there is obviously no formal definition of Abal. This is a lived practice that was practiced in predominantly auls and informally. So if you go to a philosophy department in Kazakhstan, nobody will teach you about philosophy because this is not something that is seen as a philosophy. So please bear with me. So the first one is to live in harmony with nature. And to demonstrate that, I will read you a proverb in Kazakh language to bring a bit of Kazakhstan through the language to our discussion today. Ata askartau, ana baurundağı bulak, bala jahasındağı kurak. So it compares a father to a mountain, a mother to a mountain, river, and a child to a plant. So you can see that there was a very deep connection to the way you saw yourself as a human in relation to nature. And if you read Kazakh proverbs, you can definitely see that, and time was also interpreted in relation to nature, which we will discuss in the second point of the discussion. The second point was to comply with the do no harm principle. So to demonstrate that is жоқтық ұят емес, тоқтық мұрат емес. Literal translation is absence is not shameful, abundance isn't a goal in itself and is not ideal. So basically the goal of this sort of statement was that you should not harm nature, resources, and other human beings. So the assumption was always that it's better to not overconsume water. It's better not to overconsume resources. And I think, to me, this is kind of the anti-capitalist part of the Obal philosophy. I think there was always an assumption that resources are finite. The natural resources are finite. In order to live sustainably, you have to treat both natural resources and human resources with care. And now it's important to note the goal of our work is not to romanticize or essentialize this philosophy or Kazakh oral traditions, but to highlight some of the concepts that could be relevant for our discussion. And the third is human relations. So Obal philosophy talks about peace, non-violence very strongly. So it says, Agash tamirmen, Adam dosmen mıhtı, meaning a lonely man without the community will not achieve many goals, as a tree derives strength from the soil via the root system. So I think even in defining the human-to-human relations, the philosophy still refers to nature and to the root systems and to the plants. And we wanted to highlight that even though in the literature sometimes on the steppes, on the steppe histories, historians, we don't want to claim for all historians, but it's frequently the local philosophy is overlooked, as if the steppe was just an empty sort of space and there were no knowledges. People were either deported there or it was like a temporary space holding, or maybe it was a land to be colonized where the monocrop cultures could be sort of grown. But we wanted to highlight the agency of the steppe, the oral cultures, and that's why we called it the steppe epistemology. And I also want to thank my co-author, Dr. Diana Kuderbergen, who develops a body of work on steppe epistemology as well by looking at the art and the visual art of the steppe. So maybe during Q&A I'll address that. But so these are my definitions of the steppe, primarily epistemological, and I'm very happy to be in conversation with Gail and Darya.
Thank you so much. I had questions to follow up and you can go with the main questions, but I was just struck with this, the soil at the heart of the political and administrative planning, right? Like the soil and the soil science kind of used, instrumentalized for that. And yeah, I'll keep thinking about that. But also the proverbs as a kind of an alternative archive, I guess, right? The memory, these practices, and just the way they envisioned even a tree, not as separately, but rhizomatically. I mean, you know, I feel like in Western academia, we've only been like in the past 20 years thinking about this more actively, as, you know, the way we understand trees and looking back at proverbs. It's really amazing in this sense. So we've talked about space, the steppe as space, whether epistemic space, or administrative space or geographic space. And I wanted to ask you about time and how do you think about time in your research, what time scales or temporalities you engage with, and how do you grapple with multiple time scales on the steppe? And yeah.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So first, timescales show up in my work. I mean, in these 4 ways so far. So history with a capital H, you know, a proper kind of political history of events, and I think innovation, if I may be so bold in my dissertation, is that I put together the first wave of mass Slavic immigration in the late 19th century with the regime change in, 1917 to, Civil War went on into the 20s in Central Asia, with the collectivization and forced sedentarization in 1930, early 30s, the Second World War, and the Virgin Lands campaign, which Nikita Khrushchev embarked upon in 1954. So looking at all of these, capital E historical events together in one analytical frame. And this allows me to notice the continuity and the ruptures within Russian and Soviet imperialism. So the second kind of way I'm using timescales in my dissertation is looking through agricultural history, and in this case, it's both nomadic and then settled agricultural history, and the seasonality of nomadic pastoralism versus the seasonality of crop production. And one example that I'll give you now in this brief talk is about overwintering campaigns. So it's Zimovka in Russian or Kostau in Kazakh. And Kostau is when you go to winter pastures because the steppes in the north are impenetrable for the livestock to reach the grasses. So you go further south where it's warmer, and then you can feed your animals. So with when pastoralism was no longer practiced, the advent of the Virgin Lands campaign and forages for livestock were cultivated, they had to figure out how to provision animals over winter. And so this was done primarily with hay, and hay loses its nutritional quality quite quickly depending on when it's harvested in the season. And because so much agricultural labor was tied up in harvesting spring wheat, which was the cash crop of the steppe, the quality of the hay was poor, and so there was high attrition rates in the winter for livestock. And so these kinds of small specificities of time and agricultural seasons on the steppe are important to my work and something that I pay attention to. So those are very kind of short-term seasons of time. And then I also try to look at the deep time, or the history of the Anthropocene on the Kazakh steppe. And I do this mostly by looking at nitrogen cycles and carbon cycles. So the steppe and grasslands in general are just wonderful natural resources in that the roots are very deep and they're huge carbon stores. And so I look at when you disrupt these pastures with with deep roots, these wild grasses with deep roots, and you cultivate annual grasses or corn or crops for human consumption with much shorter roots, the carbon store potential of the soil decreases dramatically. And furthermore, the nitrogen cycle of the soil on the steppe is interrupted. Whereas in pastoralism, you have cattle and livestock roaming the steppes, and their manure and their urine fertilize the soil, and their hooves kind of tamp it down, and pressing these nutrients deeper into the earth, so that it is replaced. The animals are replacing, whatever nitrogen they eat through the plant life itself. So I'm looking less kind of at geologic time and more at time in these metabolic cycles. That is kind of a hallmark of Anthropocene histories. And then finally, I will intimate this in the conclusion, but another timescale that I consider is kind of the futurity of the steppe. So in returning to the nitrogen and carbon cycle, how long does it take for the steppe to rewild after decades of crop cultivation? And what is the ultimate goal of this rewilding? And how long does it take for the nitrogen stores to be regenerated within the soil? And I think this has implications for how to hold people accountable today for past ecological imperial violence. I'd be kind of mad that the fecundity of the soil is so eroded now because of decisions that were made decades ago to continuously try to grow corn. Yes, so those are the timescales that I work with in my dissertation.
Yes, actually, I was really grateful and inspired by your speech now, because it made me think about I was trying to find the name of the little bird that lives in the steppes, and a very famous, environmental activist, Ruslan Rozgaliyev, he researches this bird, and the bird is now critically endangered because it nests in the short grass in the steppes, but now there is a long grass, but the nests cannot survive in the long grass. So they need a short grass, and they try to find other areas, and they sometimes mistake some of the other types of landscape, and the little ones cannot survive in those landscapes. So I think it's literally impacting so many life forms, and sometimes we don't even know yet about that because that research is ongoing.
Yeah.
So it's really what you do really nicely summarizes it. In Kazakh, I don't want to simplify Kazakh culture, but if you come from Kazakhstan or from Central Asia, it's very frequently you will start talking about your shejere. And shejere is the lineage of your family that you can trace back to multiple generations. And because I was born in Kazakhstan, but I'm not ethnically Kazakh, well, Professor Taligov says that people with hybrid personality should not say half this, half that, because it's not correct. But now I don't know how to unlearn how I talk about my identity. Korean and Kazakh, and even Ukrainian by proximity, because I'm married to Ukrainian. So actually, I decided to create my own steps, shejere. So, so basically, I decided I also belong there. I was born there, and through the step, I am rebuilding and repairing my relationship to Kazakhstan, and claiming some sort of temporal belonging there as well. So I also have a little shejere, which is quite creative, I should say, but. Stay with me. You at this point, you know my style. So, so step time in my research and the temporalities. I was thinking that perhaps started before I was born, because I did not choose to be born in Kazakhstan. My grandmother moved there, and this is her photo, Evgenia Saltseva. And this is my mom. This is my sister. This is my dad. Sorry, it's a small one picture, and the little one is me. And all this time, I really didn't ask my mom what happened, because my mom lost her her mother very young. So I think it was very painful for her to talk about her. Actually, she only told me this story yesterday, today. But imagine, she lived in Astrakhan, which that part was Russia, but at that time it was one country, Soviet Union. And she thought 6 or 8 hours away from me, there is this beautiful place called Dosor, and there is a beautiful lakes and a beautiful steppe, and I'll work as a doctor, and in my free time, I'll just spend time on the beach. And that was like a romantic side of the story. The sad part of the story is that her dad disappeared. He couldn't cross the Dnieper River in the Second World War, and he's buried in Ukraine to escape the pain. She thought maybe I will live in the steppe, far away from the house where he never returned to. So she moved to the steppe, and this is her father on those photos. I really like that they have a little animal horse that they're hugging. That it's actually from Ukraine. The photos from the war time Ukraine, and she moved to the shore, and to her surprise, it was not a lake; it was an oil lake. So there was no romantic step that she imagined in her, thinking. So when she came, she saw all those oil rigs and oil fields, and it was literally the logo of their little town is an oil rig. So this is the painting that I grew up with. This was always the painting in my mother's and father's room of oil rigs in the steppes. And my mom would always say, this is how the steppe looked like. A lot of trucks, and you can see all of these oil rigs day and night, and you will see sunset and the oil rigs. So the way that I imagined steppe temporalities are quite decolonial. Again, I think of it as this kind of Western notion of time was imposed on the steppe, on us in Kazakhstan, and in Kazakh philosophy. Even Kazakh usually celebrate New Year in Nowruz time. So it was all like, I think we have to work with multiple temporalities. Of course, the colonial scholars wrote about it a long time ago. Martin Stanley wrote about multiple temporalities of the steppe and the post-Soviet space. We should also unlearn the term pro-Soviet. I'm aware of that. So I work with my multiple temporalities in the steppe. And then in my, so basically steppe time and as an intergenerational story. And in my work, in my daytime job, as an academic in Oxford, I also work with temporalities and the futurities of the step and the reparative approaches to the step. And in the future-oriented time, I draw a lot of inspiration from the art spaces and philosophy as well. And it's not pictured here, but artist Aygrim Kapar, who I think joined us online today. She talks about multiple temporalities of the step and different step philosophies of the thinking of the step time as a continuum and thinking of the gender as a continuum, also thinking of them basically different understanding of the temporalities in the step. Just this morning, I learned about the new also vision of temporality. In Chinese philosophy, they talk about natural cycles and alternative time. And I think it resonates with Kazakh understanding of the time and temporalities in a nomadic way. Of course, in the modernity, it's different. I actually also want to play with the notion of modernity as well. That's why I called it Soviet and Kazakh modernities, because I think that I really play maybe too much with the understanding of the time. I take proverbs from the nomadic time, and then I develop a pedagogical approach on teaching about sustainability in the UK as decolonial praxis by elevating the knowledge of the step as to teach sustainability in the United Kingdom. I'm kind of on personal mission to decolonize at the center of the empire, academic empire. So we can talk about that during the discussion. Sometimes I do kind of play with it like a jigsaw and maybe as a swing. So yes, so I am, but I do live in the current time as well. So I know 5 minutes have passed. So
Thank you. Thank you. They added the temporality of the personal story and the intergenerational, but also I think temporality of extinction came up as you were talking, speaking. Bird is endangered. Many questions as well, including whether the oil rigs are still there, but I'll save them all later, and I'll just ask the last question from me and open to the audience. But you've mentioned different actors, including soil, but also plants there, and thinking of the steppe as a biome or an ecosystem. So and at the same time about the absence of archives. I mean, you mentioned archives, so you mentioned also philosophy departments that also don't draw on that knowledge. So can we then potentially think of the steppe as a kind of form of an archive or as an epistemic agent? And how do you engage them with the human? So what are the potentialities, but also limitations of engaging them more than human actors in your work?
Thank you. So in my dissertation at large, I have 3 chapters. One on the changes to the soil, one on changes to the plantscapes on the steppe, and then one on the changes of the genetic structure of cattle. For the sake of time and for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the changes to the soil and how the soil can be understood as an archive in and of itself, and then cow genetics. So this is a picture that I took when I went to what was the All Union Scientific Research Institute of Grain Husbandry in Shortandi, Kazakhstan. And yes, so this is a picture of 2 experimental fields that they have been cultivating for the past 3 decades. So the one on the far right kind of got cut off a bit, but it's kind of minimal technology, or what would now be considered like no plow technology, with the, minimal synthetic fertilizers and synthetic insecticides. And yes, they have different fields that have been, and data from these fields, about crop yields under various fertilizing regimes, planting regimes, intercropping, and it's being, data that they have collected, from the 1950s and 60s is being used today by ecologists to kind of estimate, as I mentioned before, like soil losses from intensive cultivation during the Virgin Lands campaign, to estimate biodiversity loss, using this repository of scientific studies that at the time when they were first published and enacted was, a tool of imperialism. So the second example of this, this again is a study from, I believe, 2022 or 2023, and it was an attempt to recreate the genetic diversity of cattle in Kazakhstan. So they're kind of mapping the genome of the Kazakh cattle, which was the predominant animal before 1930 or before collectivization. It wasn't considered a purebred breed by Soviet breeders, and we can talk about, what does it mean to be purebred. But these ethnology museums on the steppe preserved the skulls from these Kazakh and Kalmyk cattle to keep in their collections. And then the picture on the left is from, I believe, 1896 in Moscow. They had the first kind of livestock show at the agricultural exhibition. And so this is a picture of a Kalmyk cattle being shown in Moscow as a breed standard. So these scientists, actual scientists, like capital S scientists, are using data from kind of the historical record to compare that to microsatellite images and genetic mapping that they've done with the contemporary livestock herds in Kazakhstan, which since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been kind of dominated by Angus cattle now. And these indigenous Kazakh and Kalmyk breeds are on the verge of extinction, which threatens, obviously that's terrible for a species to go extinct, but it also threatens the health of the existing cattle because there's such a small pool of genetic resources. So the title is WWFDC STS. So anybody want to take a crack at what that means? Obviously, it means what would feminist decolonial science and technology scholars say about this kind of research. So trying to recreate a breed standard, for the benefits of increasing biodiversity. This is something that I continue to grapple with and need to find an answer by the third week of June. So
Speaking of temporality.
Speaking of temporality, that's what's on my mind.
Wow.
Yeah, so.
All right. So yes, really a lot to unpack in this session. The way I'm a higher education researcher, so I research higher education reform and international relations. The reason also why I'm in Chicago, because there is a huge conference happening in my field on higher education. Primarily because of you. I missed my presentation and I said, well, now I can focus on the real reasons why I'm in Chicago without distractions. So the fire. No, it's in I think actually it's really a privilege to learn about Ukrainian steppe, and I really look forward to learn more about Darya's work. I wrote an essay on tulip epistemology and higher education reform a few years ago for the book Envisioning the Future of Higher Education. Speaking about the reparative futurities in higher education research in my discipline, we always focus on economic internationalization, on cultural exchange, and the role of higher education. It's very rare that you center nature in higher education planning. If you ask undergrad students, do you know 5 plants that grow in your campus? I'm not sure.
Yes.
We should ask how many 5 types of birds local to Chicago or your neighborhood even. So, and it started to concern me about the environmental impact of student mobility, higher education, international. We as academics, I research ourselves. How do we impact the climate change? And I suggest that maybe we can learn from the plants, and maybe we can slow down, and we can think about higher education internationalization differently. Maybe we should center nature and climate change and even define sustainability differently, not as per UN SDG goals, but based on the indigenous knowledges, literature, philosophy. And just this morning, actually, we had a session with UNESCO on planning the post-development agenda. And I left it to be here. So I just would like to read a few sentences of how I envision this kind of learning to take place. There is a short period of time in between cold winters and hot summers when little endemic tulips bloom in the vast steppes of Central Asia. These resilient flowers show determination and beauty of flourishing at the time of their choosing. Gentle and little, they fill the steppe with abundant beauty and bright red, yellow, and white sea of color. One needs to be contemplative, attentive, and patient, arguably skills needed for the 21st century living. So I tried to invite educational scholars to learn to think about temporalities differently, to think about what can we learn from nature, and in a sort of this speculative, creative way. And on the photo, I think, because I work with decolonial personal alternative archives, I was thinking, how can we repair our understanding of the steppe and knowledge of the plants and our personal histories? And I think personal archives can teach us a lot. On this photo is my aunt, Larissa. Actually, PowerPoint intervened with my photo design skills. There should be long roots that are also on this photo. So, and Darya also mentioned that it was almost she got uprooted, like the plants, the tulips that she herself uprooted from the tulips, which shouldn't have happened. Maybe also I felt like it speaks to the history of my family, because we were uprooted, and I know Sarah Ahmed writes about uprooting and migration, and I think I feel like this plant that was sort of derived from the second time again, it's like, because I didn't tell the second part of my story, of family story, of Korean part, that Koreans who were deported to Kazakh steppes. And that part of the story is frequently erased from Kazakh curriculum. Korean people are usually depicted as diaspora. And I wrote 2 master dissertations about it. And I was afraid to publish it, because I thought I would never be accepted in Kazakhstan again if I criticized the host. So this, to me, is something that is missing from the decolonial discussions in Central Asia. And that's why I separated Soviet modernity from Kazakh modernity. I equally see that because of the Soviet imperialism, steppe was destroyed, family histories were destroyed. But in the case of the deported people, we were never made feel that we belong in independent nation state. And I was thinking, how can we maintain the space for multiple critiques of multiple oppressions? What can we learn from the plants about that, about the resilience, about the mistakes that were done by the colonizers who came to the steppes and rooted out the tulips? but at the same time, how can we repair this relationship with ourselves, with the history, with the complex nature of our identities, with the complex identities of belonging. And to me, this is an ongoing process. I don't have an answer to that question, but sometimes I've realized that the mountains of Central Asia have been there before me. They'll be there after me. The glaciers provide water for everyone, for plants and for humans of any ethnicity and gender. So I will write about that as a reparative practice for my field of higher education, which is so focused on human capital theory and personal wealth accumulation and individual development. And I'm trying to invite my colleagues professionally to think about it. I was surprised this essay was published, to be honest, because my colleagues understand higher education research is a very positivist field. Such stories are unusual, these kind of very frivolous interpretations of what we can learn as humans. I'm based at the Department of Education at Oxford, right? And I'm saying that we can learn from tulips. The leading education department in Europe, as per their website, but it's it's like I do think sometimes it sounds maybe a bit funny, but I do think it's serious, right? To think about Anthropocene, because sometimes when I tell my colleagues, it doesn't matter if we publish 71 publications, if you're going to die of climate change, it doesn't really matter. And when I was conducting fieldwork, 100,000 people were displaced by floods in Kazakhstan. And I said, well, you will build an elite university, but then students wouldn't be able to go there because of the floods. So that's the way I'm trying to think about tulip or uprooted epistemology inspired by Darya's feedback. So rerooted. And yeah, this was my interpretation.
Thank you so much. And you came here also in the time of tulips, as we established, right? They are about a peer, so we'll be thinking.
Precisely now.
Yeah. All the time scales worked in our case. I think it was all. Thank you so much, both. I'll probably. I mean, I have 1,000 questions, but I have a privilege to keep talking to you, and maybe we'll just we'll do a round of applause, and then we'll open to the questions. So I don't know. There's a question right there.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm from Kazakhstan. I'm doing my MA in history studies here. I was very interested in this lecture and what you have to say. And I agree that because Kazakh culture is a nomadic culture, we have very limited access to any kind of resources to know what exactly happened from the people who live there. And oral tradition is usually what I look at and not doing any kind of research. But I really appreciate how you're looking at the land and trying to recreate the history of it. And I feel like it's very important. And I felt like I wanted to say to Olga, it was a very beautiful description of what we can learn from the nature, especially in the territory of Kazakhstan that is so vast, so like filled with nature, and how we can learn, I don't know, to live together as humans and other stuff. I guess my question would be like very simple, like about the modern times. I know Gail, like you went to Kazakhstan. How are we doing these days? Like how are our actions these days affecting the land? What does it tell about us to the future generations?
Go to you. What says you one by one?
I can respond quickly that thank you for coming and thank you for also engaging with oral knowledges. I think it's quite important to engage with that part of history. I think we have to continuously examine the way our relationship with the steppe is happening. And I think the Soviet extractivism is now simply replaced, from my interpretation, by capitalist extractivism. So, of course, people do practice about philosophy, and in more private spaces, I think in the spaces of their families, most of the practices. Officially, don't think we have a Nobel policy or to live sustainably. So I think this would be my general remark, but.
in broad strokes, I would say it's in terms of agriculture on the steppe, it has only gotten worse and is following the trends of kind of these transnational agricultural corporations. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, let me back up. During the Soviet period, they were very interested in chemical and mineral inputs, as the rest of the globe was during the Green Revolution. But because of structural limitations, they didn't have money or the resources, for this. They had to rely on other means. So most of the farms, of the huge state farms, yes, it was, spring wheat monocrop agriculture, but they had to keep animals because they had to have manure. They had to have fertilizer. They had to have diverse cropping schemes to, retain minerals in the soil because they couldn't add them exogenously. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of the livestock from these collective farms went to Russia, actually. Large or kind of rich oligarchs in Russia in the early 90s kind of bought out a lot of the holdings of these collective farms. So, and then in comes, I'm grossly approximating the story, in comes transnational agricultural corporations pushing their synthetic chemicals and fertilizers, and it's become even more of a monocrop system because there are far fewer animals on the steppe. Also, importantly, there are far more abandoned fields. There just are fewer numerically farms and acres under cultivation. And so in terms of kind of the rewilding of the steppe and how that has happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the past 3 decades, what scientists have found is actually the nitrogen stores are lower than they were pre-Virgin Lands campaign because there aren't as many animals, and that the health of the steppe requires grazing ungulates to move across the vast territory. And lastly, one more thing to say, sorry. The All Union Scientific Research Institute in Shortandi, that is now, it was obviously state-run by the Soviet Union, and now Syngenta owns half of it. So I went to a kind of trade show for Syngenta, and local Kazakh farmers came, and there were academics from the university and Tension conference room.
But if I may add, there are some hopeful initiatives like Altındala conservation projects, because I'm researching and trying to collect an archive of reparative practices. So they do conservation work of reintroducing Saiga population, and it was very successful. So if you do put resources and political will, you can restore it. It's possible, the animals in the land and the practices, but it's a small initiative.
Yeah, this is just my small window. Obviously, I can't, this isn't representative.
Oh, I actually think this is representative, but I think there are like little initiatives.
Yeah.
I'll read a question from online, then we'll get back to you. It's a question from Anna Torres. Thank you so much for your talks. I would be curious to hear more about the role of language politics and translation in producing ecological status of the steppe. I appreciate the citation of proverbs, and I'm interested in hearing more about poetry, lyric, oral histories, and other literary forms which transmit ecological knowledge of the steppe. Thank you for the question. Yeah, maybe also, I guess, Olga, you can comment, but also would be interested in the language that the sources are in as well. And then, yeah.
Yeah, but it's an easy, short answer. It's 98% of the documents that I came across were in Russian. Maybe the masthead was in Kazakh. even from the early decades, in the 1930s, it was all in Russian. So that's the scientific literature that I'm looking at.
What about research about the Kazakh steppe in English? How big is that field?
Less than, yeah, I find a lot more historical works and ecological works written in Russian, and unfortunately, I don't have the language skills to access the Kazakh literature, but it is great.
For a postdoc.
Yes, yes. It is, yeah, greater than what is written in English.
I think this is a very good and difficult question. I do try to access academic articles that are published in Russian, Kazakh, and English languages, and it's not easy. A lot of the resources are not digitized, so you have to literally search for those books in the archives. And even if you come to the National Archive, they don't have a full collection of folklore stories that were collected by the most famous folklorist, Kaskabasov. So, supposed to be at the National Library. But so sometimes it's like really searching for personal archives, searching for personal copies given to you by the authors. So it's really like a very difficult and lengthy process. It takes a lot of time. Myself and Diana could begin, we are trying to cite intentionally resources in multiple languages, and it takes us twice the time to write a paper, to then check the credibility of the resources, to check the, and then the reviewers also kind of fight back, right? So but there is a lot of material on the steppe in Kazakh language and in Russian language. Kazakh Academy of Sciences produces 98% of their research in Kazakh language. This is the main, kind of colonial Soviet structure, but 98% of the research published in Kazakh language in humanities and social sciences. There is a wealth of materials of master's dissertations, doctoral dissertations, books, dozens, hundreds of academic publications. So those materials are there. They are not particularly all of them digitized and properly stored, but they are there. So it is possible to engage with those knowledges. And Kazakh-German writer Gerald Belger said that translation is a particular type of knowledge production process. So he read, he was fluent in Kazakh, so he was translating the steppe literally, even though he is German, because he grew up in the steppe. But he did read and cite literature in Russian language as well. Faustovsky wrote a lot about Kazakh steppe. So if you speak Russian language, you can read Faustovsky. From more decolonial perspective, of course, you would need to go beyond that. A lot of Korean writers wrote about the steppe in Russian language. I can give you a list because a lot of childhood memories are related to the steppes for a lot of Korean Kazakhstani writers and artists too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Really wonderful and so much interesting thought. I guess I have two questions. First, following up on the language kind of idea. First question is kind of like is about education, and I guess what's the future for education on sustainability, on these kinds of issues in an environment like Gail described, where there are very much like corporate interests at play alongside the interests of actors who are maybe more authentically interested and invested in the issue of sustainability. I mean, I remember I was in Astana for the expo in 2017, and the theme was sustainability. And and one of the Russia's exhibition was sustainable oil drilling in the Arctic. And it's kind of like, if the idea of sustainability can be distorted to kind of include that as a fundamental premise, I guess how do we approach education about these topics in a way which, on the one hand, kind of works with that language, but on the other hand, combats maybe powerful interpretations of that language. So that's one question, and the other question for Gail is kind of this work on kind of rewilding the steppe. I'm curious how much of it is based on the Soviet science that you've been finding, and how much of it is kind of new research that's started afresh, or how much it's kind of rooted in those cosmological frameworks.
I was thinking about philosophy is not policy. What happens if it becomes policy? I was kind of like imagining.
This is a difficult question. I personally think, as a radical scholar, I'm okay with that branding of myself. So we have to rewild not only the steppe, but the university itself. And actually, there is a new book on rewilding the university. So we have to just change our paradigms, the way we think about education or economics or racial capitalism, colonial racial capitalism. So it's difficult. It is possible. At the moment in Kazakhstan, even the mainstream definitions of sustainability are not taught. In Central Asia, there is no single climate change education program in any university across 5 countries. So even if you would like to start these mainstream conversations, they're not happening. And I think that's why they're happening in the civil society space. The civil society space, especially in authoritarian countries, is where the resistance takes place. That's why about philosophy is important, because it's a lived philosophy, it's sustainable, it's resilient, it resisted the Soviet oppression and survived. And in social epistemology, there is this term of resistant knowledges that resist the oppression, but also are strong, as in resisting. So I think maybe the strength of that, it was not institutionalized and co-opted. That's why it survived. But of course, it's a big question. It's very difficult question. Because there is not a lot of funding for these topics, and the funding that does come from Shell and other CSR initiatives. If you look at the new literature, it's funded by these private companies because there is no other source of funding. So it's and even in the space of education, there will be scholars who would argue for that approach, right? The majority of educational researchers would argue for the sustainable oil drilling, right? Something like as a realistic approach, or sort of a pragmatic approach. And Kazakhstan's economy depends on oil drilling. So it's this kind of, then we start thinking about the notions of development and progress, and how do we change that? And it's a topic for a second workshop, but it's a very difficult question.
I remember that scholars from Kazakhstan funded by the government coming to Scotland at the University of St Andrews, and at some point they cut the program for any political science or anything, only for oil driven. They continued scholarships, right? But if you're actually going into engineering, yeah.
Yes, to answer the question about rewilding the steppe and the place of Soviet science. This is kind of an answer. So during the Virgin Lands campaign, millions of hectares of Kazakh steppe was overturned, former grazing lands for livestock, and converted into croplands for spring wheat. Soon they realized the massive soil erosion on the steppe, and one of the methods to ameliorate soil erosion that this All Union Scientific Research Institute of Great University found was one, to leave the land lie fallow for longer than is conventional wisdom in other parts of the Soviet Union, and two is to only cut the crops and leave the stalks, and then bring in the livestock so that they can graze on the stalks. And so they developed this system of dryland farming and dryland amelioration that was then kind of exported in the 70s as a part of the UN environmental program, their relief efforts in the famine in the Sahel. And then other kind of grasslands and rangelands scientists came to Kazakhstan to study this method. So that's one answer to the question. Another answer, if I may. So Vasily Dokuchayev is considered the kind of father of modern notions of soil science, seeing soil as a biogeochemical substance. And he's Russian and Russian trained. He didn't know any foreign languages, and most soil scientists at the time were trained in Germany, and soil chemistry and agronomists, they were trained in Germany, but Vasily Dokuchayev was kind of a Russian national hero, and in 1890, 1891, there was a famine and crop failure in the kind of Ukrainian and Southern Russian steppes. And so Dokuchayev and his team were commissioned to study the steppes of Ukraine and Southern Russia and to figure out how to successfully practice agriculture and kind of combat these climatic limitations. And one of the conclusions that he draws is that, agriculture you should just let it, go back to natural pasture and kind of rewild. And kind of his research was the impetus to create a zapovednik, like a natural resource management area. And so in 1948, if you're familiar with Stalin's great plan for the transformation of nature, which is, I know all of you have read this many times, which is all about planting shelter belts in the steppe, that we can, through human ingenuity, and we can overcome the limitations of nature. Stalin kind of resuscitates Dokuchayev and the memory of Dokuchayev, and reinterprets it and speaks nothing of kind of rewilding the steppe and letting it return to its kind of pre-agricultural roots, but kind of heralds him as this kind of Russian nationalist. He's not, scientist. So there's some selective forgetting of science in the rewilding of the steppe.
In the Kazakh National Museum, there is like an exhibit on the architecture of Astana, and the shelter belts are part of that.
Yeah.
And it's
It's
attributed to Nazarbayev. It says Nazarbayev thought of the shelter belt as an idea for the architecture.
Wow.
Surroundings.
That is not my interpretation of the historical events.
Belts play a very important role in Ukraine because they shelter people from science. So they can shift their meanings as a kind of architecture. But we didn't know that Nazarbayev. I knew that. Any other questions?
There are two in the chat.
Well, there's one more. Thank you. Wait.
Oh, I think there was a question at the back.
I'll ask.
Elise, I think you had a question. You raised your hand, no?
There are two questions. Shall we go in the chat and then back to the audience?
Sure.
I'll do the question from Irina Skubi, a fellow studying to have. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your wonderful and insightful talks. Would you please, I guess, say whether you view the steppe as a place and a space of multi-ethnic relations, violence, and subjugation, also in a long durée? Do you see the value of applying this idea in a comparative context and include in other steppe regions, countries of Eurasia like Ukraine? And what would be the advantages and disadvantages of such approach? Would you please say whether you view the steppe as a place and space of multi-ethnic relations, violences, and subjugation, also in a long durée? I guess historically. I'm thinking of Ukraine there somewhere in the Eurasian steppe.
Ukraine deportations to Kazakh steppes is the central history of a Kazakh steppe. Ukrainians were deported to Kazakhstan because the assumption was that to live there is a punishment. So I think there is a direct link of thinking about it. And if you look at the Ukrainian literature of Kazakhstan, which is a subfield of Kazakh literature, there are people write about that. And it's, yeah, I think somebody perhaps could explore that. I know that Kazakh, well, Central Asian historians, decolonial historians like Botagoska, Tsymbalyuk, and other colleagues are rethinking the notion of the ethnic as a category imposed by Stalin. So I think some people even maybe will not longer use the category ethnic. I myself am not sure how to work with those concepts. Let's say if they're colonial concepts, but then they have lived for so long that people actually use them. How do we unlearn them? How do we think about that beyond the ethnic categories? But I think that's why Dr. Kodebergen, Darya, Tsymbalyuk, and myself, we are thinking about Anthropocene and the steppe and thinking beyond national borders. By looking at Ukraine, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and I think you can really then see different categories, different connections, direct connection between Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and I think those are kind of very important on the research connections.
It's also interesting because the soil scientists also did exactly that. They kind of looked and compared.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah. How do you use these instruments, I guess? I mean, I'm just
Ethically too,
Yeah.
ethically and respecting the differences and nuances and different interpretations and political sensitivities, temporalities. So,
Yeah, so the question is about different ethnicities on the steppe and how does that
And it's been a space of violence and subjugation.
in a space of violence and subjugation? I mean, yes, absolutely. That is the history of the steppe. But I think I'm just spitballing here. It's also a question of agency, and I try to think about this myself. You know, so the first wave of Slavic peasant migration occurred in the early 1890s after this famine on other parts of the steppe, and Russian and Ukrainian peasants just picked up their tools and left. You know, they left their fields that had been exhausted after all this time, and the state encouraged them. They provided free transit to the steppe. They gave them kind of a stipend to kind of set up their new homesteads. But is that, could you say that is like peasant violence? Like, you know, where's the agency in that system? They didn't know that they were coming upon nomadic grape pastures. You know, that wasn't a part of the deal. They didn't have all that. Yeah, so that's just one example that I'm thinking of ethnic violence. I mean, of course, there are gulags on the Kazakh steppe, and that can't be ignored. The violent deportations of different populations,
the hunger.
and the hunger, yeah, yes, obviously, yes, pardon me, everyone on Zoom for not mentioning that. The famines of forced sedentarization and collectivization.
It's interesting though, I don't know if it resonates in the context you're working with. I think in Ukraine, the steppes also have been kind of mythologized as the space of freedom, because that's where people run away, right? That's what you said, like your grandmother as well, right? And they were always, I mean, I kind of sometimes think, and I don't know how to also, like, the question I have sometimes, how do we exit the space? Because they've been also kind of narrated as a frontier space with all the potential opportunities that people could, like the new land, freedom, the marriage that they didn't want to be forced into, they would escape, pregnant women as well to look for, I don't know, to get away, like all kind of people would move. So that's kind of historically narrativized. And I think that myth lasts, but at the same time, because of this frontier mythology, you do imagine this place is kind of violent, and obviously now the majority of the fighting in Ukraine happens in the steppe regions, and I wonder how that old myth maps on into this new imagination of destroyed land, emptied spaces, but emptied military in Ukraine. So I'm also thinking about that, and a space of violence in itself, and in a complex way that I think sometimes kind of fixates the space in a particular violent frame in itself of imagination. I don't know whether that's where Ira was coming from. But I sometimes think of like, how do you exit that way of narrate? We have one more question online, but maybe I'll give a chance.
We have one. We have two more.
We'll go one online, one, and then maybe we'll take all three. We'll take all three, and we have around 7 minutes. Let's take maybe all three. So whoever's in the audience.
I think I will just keep it really short. I'm coming from the Canadian context, so of course in Canada we have this vast literature on like indigeneity and feminist decolonial approaches towards ecology. And I was wondering, just like from your own work, to which extent you engage with that literature, and to what extent there is even an existing literature already in concentration camps. I don't come from concentration studies, so I'm just curious.
I'll take another one from the audience, and then I'll read mine.
I had a question for Olga, and then just, so I was wondering if in your work thinking about reparative justice, if you engage with the idea of crafting, so kind of thinking about, within any political metaphoric frame and displacement, thinking about how communities or populations, particularly Pakistani become integrated into kind of an ecosystem. That was just kind of one question. And then for Gail, I was just wondering if we come across the work of Dr. Virginia Martin, who's a historian of the Kazakh steppe, but in the earlier part of the 19th century. She engages a lot with Kazakh texts as well as Russian texts, and focuses on kind of land tenure and Kazakh nomads. So if you haven't come across her work, it might be an interesting kind of extension just to see how Kazakh nomads were interacting with the kind of Tsarist center. And she also has a forthcoming book where she's like kind of looking at Kazakh, Chagatai, and a number of different kind of translanguaging texts, seeing how Kazakh nomads are kind of engaging with, negotiating with Moscow and different centers of power. So just to flag if you haven't, Virginia Martin's work is really good.
So I'll read the question online from Maya Haida. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm curious to think with you about how this notion of the steppe and steppe futurities can help us think about solidarities across geographies, especially because the steppe and other similar grassland ecologies spans such a wide and diverse expanse of the globe. Is this something your work is also thinking through, whether through scholarship, art, community action, or another form?
Actually,
I don't know if you remember.
I know.
So, yeah.
Maybe we can tackle the first two and then.
Okay.
Just to quickly answer, I think we are aware of the literature on Indigenous education in Canada and with the works of Vanessa Jyoti Machado, right? I think, yes, I think those conversations are happening. I'm not sure really people in Central Asia read literature in English language. Like those kind of conversations are different from academic conversations that we're having. They happen artistically. There is an exhibition in London now on Indigenous cultures of Central Asia and climate change and water. And there are artists from Latin America as a part of that exhibition who talk about trees, indigenous knowledge, and culture in conversation with Kazakh artists. So those conversations happen in multiple scales, spaces. To what extent, I would be curious what the Canadian scholars engage in this Kazakh writers. I would like a citation, but sometimes I'm thinking there's a lot of pressure on scholars from the global south to engage with international scholarship, but sometimes it's also I think it's okay not to always engage with scholarship in this English language, but of course the indigenous scholarship is not in English language.
I meant like whether there's some sort of like impetus within sort of Central Asia to have their own indigenous literature on like college, like if you're referring to that.
Yeah, I think the term indigenous is contested. I think maybe it would be said nomadic. Nomadic. In fact, not all people in Kazakhstan were nomadic. There were cities and settlements and sedentary people. So actually, it's a very complex space across centuries and times. It was so different. It's very difficult for me to think about time. Yeah, I do. But and at least your question, I didn't catch the. You said the grain.
Grafting, GRAFT, idea of kind of almost like fusing two different types of flora, fauna together, and then kind of creating a new species. So it's a gardening. I'm not a happy gardening person, but I mean I was thinking about that when you were talking, like this idea of grafting things together, bringing things together, and then like something kind of new being created, and also kind of acknowledging it maintains kind of a primordial sense of identity and nationality.
Yes.
But I just thought that
Yes.
it was interesting to convey.
Yes, and maybe the scholarship from Latin America helps us to think about creolization and all those other identities. But definitely, I think it happened within nature and culturally. There are a lot of mythologies among Koreans in Kazakhstan, whether they brought the rice to Kazakhstan and who brought the rice to Kazakhstan, and whether every single Central Asian dish actually has Korean grown rice or Uyghur grown rice, and this kind of fresh rice nationalism. I don't know, it's a very good question. I personally do not support the idea of primordial nationalism. I think we kind of hopefully move beyond that, but not maybe in a collective imagination in Kazakhstan. And the way state defines the nation, Koreans are always Ukrainians, Polish people, Germans are depicted as diaspora, as guests, even though they have been born there, actually. So this is a very serious and I think under-researched topic, even though we have new books on what does it mean to be Kazakhstani, but even those books, with all due respect to my close friend Diana, rarely engage with the scholarship produced by Koreans in Kazakhstan and all of that. So those kind of levels of hypersensitivities are still not there, in my understanding. I'd love to see more of that. And
To address the first question, I tread very lightly in using indigenous North American scholarship and applying it elsewhere. You know, as Olga said, you know, indigenous is a contested category. And also I don't want to kind of homogenize indigeneity or, you know, make that a universal category with universal relationships to land and animals. But the similarities are ripe for comparison about the frontier in the North American context of the prairies, the mass genocide of Native Americans there, killing off of the bison, and then plowing up all that land to grow corn. You know, it's a
if I may add, the
please.
nuclear testing sites. I
Yeah.
think this is a commonality of how the step was used as a nuclear testing site in Kazakhstan and in many other contexts, right? So I think
Yeah. So I'm kind of still working through the similarities, and I want to be very careful with it. There was a lot of scientific exchange between Kazakhstan and Saskatchewan. The grain research, like Barayev, Alexander Barayev, who was founded the All Union Scientific Research. He went to Saskatchewan himself in the 1968. Yes. Virginia Martin's work. Yes. I haven't, deeply engaged with it just because part of my point is to see how Russian administration kind of limited possibility of land use on the steppe. And that's, yeah, a blind spot in my own approach. And the
Solidarities.
Oh, the solid.
The question of whether how this notion of the steppe and steppe futures can help us think about solidarities across geography. Very small question.
A quick response.
A minute.
Quick response. A lot of artists in Central Asia produced anti-war statements in Kazakh language, artistically in songs, and some of those videos are filmed in the kind of landscapes, I think, emanating the steppe. And maybe, I'm not sure if it was done intentionally or unintentionally, those solidarities take place and sonically as well. And we wrote just, the people got accepted on Asar and Jong local concepts of solidarity sonically and artistically. And we write about those practices in Kazakhstan. So even in the authoritarian context, there is a space for resistance and solidarities. And some artists use nature to show solidarity and language too. For example, the song, there is a music band called Moldonazet, and they wrote a song, Kuvershin, which means dog. And it's in Kazakh language, but it's mostly dedicated to the war in Ukraine. And the translation subtitles is in Ukrainian language. They wanted to make sure that's kind of a statement. So there are solidarity for sure.
I mean, just the nature of my subjects, I think there are solidarities. I look at scientists and statesmen. There are certainly solidarities since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and science as an enterprise has kind of opened to the rest of the world. And many of these research teams of capital S scientists that I showed are, from Germany and from Russia and Ukraine, and very multinational. And comparing the steppes and the grassland and the prairies and the pampas, and trying to think of them in an era of global climate change. What are the potentials, and then what are the kind of limitations of that?
Yeah, and I think this conversation as well about happening and trying to build a bigger space, talking about the steppe. So if you're a steppe enthusiast, please reach out. We are looking for you. Yeah. Thank you so much once again. Thank you everybody for staying with us.